Please join me in welcoming Dr. Allison Applebaum to the Penn Memory Center. We're very excited to have her. She's a caregiving scientist, writer, researcher, speaker, and advocate. She's an associate attending psychologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and an associate professor of psychology at Weill Cornell Medicine. Dr. Applebaum is the founding director of the Caregivers Clinic at MSK. The Caregivers Clinic is the first of its kind to provide targeted psychosocial support to caregivers of patients receiving cancer care at MSK. She is also the author of the recently published narrative nonfiction book, Stand By Me, a guide to navigating modern, meaningful caregiving. And I'm going to put a link to purchase her book in the chat. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Applebaum and say thank you so much for joining us and take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, Allison. I'm so excited to be joining you all. As I share with Allison, the most anxiety-provoking part of speaking for me is, does the technology work? So let me see if I can share my slides and also share my sound. And give me one sec. And are you able to see that?
Yes, slides look good.
Fantastic. All right. Perfect. So I want to speak to you today, both as a caregiving scientist and as a family caregiver, and to share some of the most important lessons that I've learned as a result of my career in caregiving science over the past 15 years, and from my experience of taking care of my father. Everyone in this room is a caregiver, or was a caregiver, or will be a caregiver. This is a role that touches 53 million individuals in the United States today, at least, a role that deeply changes who we are and forever changes the trajectory for our life moving forward. There are certain roles that have been described as caregiving, that of a parent and child. This picture was taken on November 4th of 1981, the day that I was born, the day that my dad became my dad. But there are other types of caregiving roles, the focus of my talk, that have a much different emotional tone. The care we provide for our parents and partners and children and siblings and friends who live with chronic and life-limiting illnesses and disabilities and depend on us for care. This picture was taken on November 4th of 2013, 32 years later, as I was my dad's primary caregiver. What these two roles and these two pictures have in common is love. That is what is at the heart of what it means to be a caregiver. As caregivers, we give of ourselves physically, emotionally, spiritually, existentially, and financially. And we do so too often without training, education, and support. And what we give of ourselves is care, is love. Now, before I speak any further about caregiving, I want to tell you a little bit about my dad, Stan Applebaum. My dad was born in 1922. And he had initial career aspirations to become a surgeon. But he fell out of a tree when he was 7 years old, and the doctor who took care of him suggested that in order to heal the pinky finger that he broke, he should tap that pinky finger on the player piano my grandparents had at home. And little did that doctor know that his prescription would lead to a musical career that would span nearly a century. My dad was drafted into World War II, and it was music that saved his life. He was fighting in Wiesbaden, Germany, and he was able to convince the commanding officer that he could better use his pianist fingers as a teletypist and convey important communications to Washington as opposed to holding a gun. And he was transferred to the special services and eventually back home to safety. He used the GI Bill to study music and composition. And by the time he was 30 years old, he was one of the most sought after arrangers and orchestrators in New York. And by the time he was 40, he was writing hit arrangements for all the big artists of the 50s and 60s, including Benny King and Neil Sedaka, Connie Francis, and Brian Hyland. Now, while not everyone in this room was born at the time that this song was written, my guess is that everyone in this room has heard this string line before. My dad had a hand in every part of Benny King's Stand By Me, but what turned that song from a piece of music into a piece of art was the string line in the middle, which was my dad's. So now you've all met Stan Applebaum. My dad's was a life of music, but much more importantly, it was a life of creativity. And what that meant was he was always wanting to learn and grow. Even when he was stuck in a hospital bed at the end of his life, he was still writing music in his mind, and he chose to learn Tagalog, the language of his home health aides in his 90s. He never wanted to stop growing. And that was so critical for me as his caregiver to convey to members of the healthcare team. Now, my dad was an incredibly masterful musician, but of course, much more importantly to me, he was an incredibly talented father. He modeled for me emotional vulnerability. He was exquisitely supportive. And around him, I felt safe, I felt loved, and I felt expansive. All right, now I'll turn back to caregiving. When I joined the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in 2010, I was working primarily with patients with advanced life-limiting cancers. And in the sessions I had with those patients, what was so striking to me is their narratives did not focus so much on their own mortality, but instead on the individuals left in the waiting room, the individuals left at home, their parents and partners and children and siblings and friends, who they identified as the linchpin of their care and the individuals who would be most deeply impacted by their eventual deaths. I also realized at that time that cancer care and healthcare more broadly was increasingly relying on family caregivers to shoulder tremendous responsibilities without increased training. And I also realized at the time that there was no targeted service in this country to provide support to family caregivers. And so a year later in 2011, I founded the Caregivers Clinic at MSK, whose mission is to assure that no caregiver experiencing significant distress as a result of their caregiving role goes unidentified and deprived of necessary psychosocial services. The same year I began the clinic, my own caregiving journey began. My dad lived until his early 90s with really only minor medical problems. I brought him to the hospital with a UTI at that time, and he developed delirium, a confused or altered mental state with which I'm sure many of you are familiar. It can be very scary for caregivers. Without the consent of my mother, who at the time was his healthcare proxy, or myself, my dad was given an antipsychotic medication, and that medication put him into a coma. And he was in this state for about 2 weeks. No one knew why. But what became so very clear to me during this time, without me by his side to serve as his eyes, his ears, and his voice, that there was no way for any member of the passing medical teams to have any idea who Stan Applebaum was and what mattered to him. They would have no idea that this man was still committed to learning and growing, despite the date of birth, 1922, on his wristband, and clearly his limited cognitive status. And I want to highlight then the first important lesson to share with you, and that is that you are responsible for preserving the identity of your care partner, for telling their story or helping them to tell their story. Now, in my book, in the first chapter, I have a list about all the information that you should have on hand when you bring your care partner to the emergency room. I'm not going to go through this list right now. What I want to highlight, however, is that just as important as you conveying their health history, their medications, the events that led to that ER visit, just as important as those pieces of information is your conveying who your care partner is, what their goals of care are, and what their goals of life are. Only then can they receive person-centered, value-driven care. Now, had I not done that, had I not stood by my dad during that period of time, there's no way that he would have survived this hospitalization and gone on to enjoy 6.5 more years of life, where he's able to enjoy moments out in the sunshine, drinking one of his favorite drinks. Now, during this time, the second lesson I want to share with you became so very clear to me, which I'm guessing is no surprise to all of you. And that is that you are a critical member of the healthcare team. As family caregivers, we don't have pagers, we don't wear white coats, but we are critical team members. In fact, we are often a missing link between patients and healthcare professionals. We are brokering information between patients and healthcare professionals. We are the hub of an info flow wheel that absolutely cannot turn without us. And as members of the healthcare team, our responsibilities are vast. And I want to highlight 3 domains of these responsibilities that oftentimes come as a surprise to caregivers in my clinical practice because of how enormous these responsibilities can get. That is handling medical and nursing tasks, case management, and healthcare communication. Now, all of us as family caregivers are going to be asked to handle medical and nursing tasks. And these are only increasing and going to get more. And the reality is that we are asked to do things that were once assumed only by trained healthcare professionals. For me, I took my dad's vital signs. I cleaned the opening to a suprapubic catheter. I took care of his catheter bags. I cared for bed sores and wounds that he had, and I gave him injectable medications weekly. I was never trained to do so. And my guess is for many of you, you may have not been received any training. But I do want to highlight for you one policy in our country that is supportive of family caregivers called the Caregiver Advise, Record, Enable Act. If we were in person, I would ask you to raise your hand and tell me if you're familiar with it. What I want to say, this act is currently passed in 45 states and territories, including Pennsylvania, and it has 3 provisions. Requires hospitals to document the name and contact information of caregivers when patients are admitted to hospitals. Requires hospitals to let caregivers know when patients are going to be transferred or discharged. And very importantly, it says that hospitals should be providing us as caregivers with information and training so that we know how to take care of our loved one when we get home. Now, my guess is that for many of you, this isn't happening. It's not consistently implemented. It certainly didn't happen for me. So I want to give you a tip. Before you leave the hospital, and I know that that transition from hospital to home can be one of the most overwhelming. Before that transition, I want you to have a nurse or another member of that medical team demonstrate for you all the things you're going to have to do at home to take care of your loved one. And then I want you to demonstrate those tasks back to that person so that you can feel confident to do so. And then if your care partner receives visits from a visiting nurse, as my dad often did when he was discharged from the hospital, I want you to consider every visiting nurse visit not only an opportunity for your care partner to be evaluated, but for you to brush up on your skills. Now, the second domain of responsibility is case management. Case managers are, by definition, paid employees of hospitals to coordinate care, but we all know we do this for free. And on that note, I want to acknowledge, you probably are aware that last year, the AARP estimated that the value of our efforts as caregivers accounts for $63 billion, despite the fact that 1/4 of caregivers report high financial strain. As case managers, we do so much. We navigate coordination of care, insurance reimbursements, and even navigating home health care. We spend a lot of time on the phone doing this all. That's why I have this picture here. And for me, my most prominent case management responsibility was actually getting my dad enrolled in Medicaid and establishing a plan for home health care for him. Now, I'm not going to go into the steps right now, but in my book in chapter 7, I do go through the steps to get a care partner onto Medicaid and secure home health care if that's a route you're interested in. What I want to emphasize today is the process is an incredibly long one. Wait times start at 1 year. So this is on your radar. I want you to get started now. The third domain of responsibility that oftentimes is really an elephant in the room is healthcare communication. This is really the bread and butter of what we do as family caregivers. We are tasked with having very important conversations with our care partners and members of the healthcare team. And throughout the book, I provide a lot of tips and tools to help you have conversations, both with your care partner and the medical team. I want to highlight 2 of these very practical tips for you today. First is, many caregivers who come to my clinical practice will say to me that there are certain topics that they want to bring up with the doctor, with the oncologist in the case of MSK, but they are not sure their care partner wants actually to talk about that topic or to hear the answer. What happens then is if a caregiver holds back from asking a certain question, then that question never gets answered. And in fact, that caregiver gets isolated. And we all know that those appointments go very, very quickly. What I want to encourage you to do is have what we call a consent conversation in advance of the visit with the doctor. If there's something that you want to talk about and you're not sure your care partner wants to talk about, the consent conversation might sound something like this. Dad, I would really like to ask your doctor what treatments are available if this treatment stops working. Would that be okay? Having the consent conversation will allow the two of you to get on the same page before that next visit with the doctor. Now, another instance when this can be particularly helpful is if you notice that your care partner is not necessarily engaging in appropriate health-related behaviors. Perhaps they're drinking alcohol or smoking cigarettes and shouldn't be, or perhaps they're not exercising, or perhaps they're not taking their medications. In this case, a consent conversation might sound something like this. Babe, I'm concerned about how difficult you're finding it to remain adherent to your medications. I think it's important that your doctor knows you are taking them daily. Can we mention this to him next week? Now, look, if the answer is no, that's okay. You can ask again in advance of the subsequent visit with the doctor. Now, our role as communicators is most critical when we step into the role of healthcare proxy. And as a healthcare proxy, our job is to bring our care partner's voice into the room. What I did mention earlier is after that coma, my dad was diagnosed with Lewy body disease, a progressive neurodegenerative disease that leads to fluctuations both in autonomic functioning and consciousness, which in my dad led to sudden drops in blood pressure and temperature, as well as hallucinations. And these hallucinations could last anywhere from a few minutes to at one point a whole week. And therefore, there were many periods in which my role as healthcare proxy was very critical. Now, in order for us to carry out our responsibility as a healthcare proxy, we must bring our care partner's voice into the room. Their goals of care must be known. And in order for us to know those goals of care, we have to ask our care partners about those goals of care. And in order to do that, we invite an elephant into the room. And that elephant is death. So these can be very, very difficult conversations to have. And yet they're some of the most important you will have. To help you, I encourage you to do what we call setting the agenda. Setting the agenda allows you to put out on the table immediately what it is you want to talk about and why. And setting the agenda is something that you can practice far in advance of the conversation so you can feel as comfortable as possible to do so. So with my dad, setting the agenda sounded something like this. I know this is hard to talk about, but I would really like us to discuss what type of treatment you want to receive if we can no longer control your Lewy body disease fluctuations. It's important for me to know what you want so that I can be sure to carry out your wishes if you can't tell your doctors what you want at that time. Can we talk about this? Now, again, my dad could say no, in which case I would say, that's okay. I'm going to ask you again in the future. What is most important for me to emphasize, however, is that this is not a conversation you're going to have once or twice. This is a conversation that must be repeated. Must be repeated because goals of care change. When my dad wanted in 2013 for his care was dramatically different than what he wanted in 2019. And had I not had those repeated conversations, there would have been no way for me to know what type of care he wanted and to be able to bring his voice into the room. Okay, so I know that bringing up, talking about goals of care and that elephant in the room can be really stressful. So this is a perfect moment for me to review with you one of the most powerful and simplest stress management techniques for caregivers. And that is the deep diaphragmatic breath. The deep diaphragmatic breath is you're taking a very deep breath in through your nose, holding it for 3 seconds. I can't talk and hold at the same time, so 3 seconds. And then exhaling slowly through your mouth. We want the deep breath in through our nose because that's going to get as much oxygen to our brain. That's going to then lower our stress hormone cortisol and allow us to reduce our stress. And I want you all right now, I can't see you, but I want you to all at least take 1 minute of deep diaphragmatic breaths and ideally keep breathing that way while I speak. I can have the stress and you can relax. This is important because these types of breaths can be very powerful in helping you prepare for setting the agenda or any important conversation. All right, I hope you're all breathing that way while I continue. As a clinical psychologist, I focus my career on addressing the needs of family caregivers, in part because we know that the distress caregivers experience in many instances is much higher than the distress experienced by the patients for whom they provide care. Caregivers are at high risk for depression, anxiety, trauma symptoms, insomnia, and suicidality. According to the National Alliance for Caregiving, 21% of caregivers in this country say their health is fair or poor, and 36% experience high emotional distress. Not surprising, but very concerning. And just because I'm a clinical psychologist does not mean I was immune to any of these feelings. This picture was taken a few weeks before my dad died in February of 2019. And in this moment, as he lay on my shoulder, I was feeling so many of the things that my patients have shared with me. I was so burnt out. I was lost. I felt powerless. I felt isolated. And of course, I felt sad. What I want to emphasize right now is that every one of these feelings on the screen right now are normal. These emotions are normal. In fact, as a psychologist, I get much more concerned when I meet a caregiver who's in a difficult situation, who says to me that they're doing fine. That to me is a red flag. But what I want to highlight for you is that, yes, we're going to experience all of these emotions at some point, but we can use them to our advantage. And this is the third lesson I want to share. Emotions are messengers, and they tell us how to live more fully. And I want to explore this with you using three emotions that come up very frequently in my clinical practice, emotions that are often accompanied by judgment. The first emotion is anger. Everyone in this room is who is a caregiver. You have every right to be angry. You have every right to be angry that your life has been put on hold. Your dreams may have been deferred because of caregiving. You might not have had a choice to do this. And that anger needs to come out. And by that, I am not suggesting you go yell at your care partner, but I am suggesting that you do allow yourself to yell into a pillow, or close the car door and yell, or get that emotion out in a therapy session or with a close friend. But I also want to highlight that anger is a messenger. I was working with a woman a few years ago, and she shared with me that she was so angry at her husband because of his cancer treatment. He was no longer able to do the things around the house that he once did. They were no longer able to travel. They were no longer able to have sex. They were no longer able to be the couple that they once were. And she said she was so angry at him. But what came up in our session was that when she looked at her husband, weak and debilitated, she was grieving. She was grieving the loss of the man she had married. And for her, as it is for all of us, beneath anger, there's often a very, very deep well of sadness. The next time you feel angry, whatever it's about, caregiving or something else, I want you to check in with yourself and see, what are you grieving? And it doesn't have to be life and death. Losses happen every day for us. And can you express some of that sadness? And if you can, your anger is going to likely dissipate. The second emotion I want to highlight is disgust. Let's be honest. There are elements of caregiving that are disgusting. It's disgusting to change the diaper of an adult parent or partner or child. It's disgusting to change colostomy bags or clean wounds that are having a strong odor. These tasks are literally disgusting. What I hear in my clinical practice that's not helpful, however, and something I'm very guilty of myself, is the judgment for ourselves for feeling disgust. I had an experience I talk about in the book where I was tasked with changing my dad's diaper. And after this was completed, and it was, by the way, one of the most physically challenging tasks I've ever done. I understand why they do it in pairs of two in hospitals. Once I had completed this task, I was in the living room and I started to cry. And I was crying because I felt so disgusted. And then I was judging myself. What an awful person I am for feeling disgust. Here's my dad. He's alive. He was in a coma last year. You should just be grateful. What would have been so much more helpful for me in that moment, instead of judging myself, would have been think to myself, what would my best friend say? In fact, she eventually called me later that night and she told me what an incredible job I was doing, that I was able to change my dad's diaper and get him through the night. As we all know, changing a diaper can be life-saving. Had I not changed a diaper, that feces would have gone into my dad's bed sore. We would have ended up right back at the hospital. She applauded me the way that I wanted to applaud myself. I want you all, the next time you feel disgust, to ask yourself, what would my best friend say to me if they could watch me right now? And then I want you to internalize as best you can that voice. And finally, it wouldn't be a talk on caregiving if I don't talk about guilt. Guilt is one of the most common words I hear in my clinical practice. Caregivers say to me, Dr. Applebaum, I shouldn't be here. I should be at the bedside of my husband. Dr. Applebaum, I shouldn't be here. I'm not the patient with cancer. When we feel guilt, we have the thoughts, the woulda, shoulda, couldas. We feel like we're letting someone else down. The reality is that when we feel guilt, the person we are letting down or about to let down is not our care partner, but ourselves. Guilt is a beautiful red flag that we are neglecting our own needs. And it tells us we're actually going in the wrong direction. The next time you all feel guilt, I know you will, I want you to ask yourself, if I keep doing this thing, or if I move forward in this direction, in what way am I neglecting myself? And see if you can commit to doing something for your own benefit instead. Now, I want to just also acknowledge that while emotions are messengers and we can use them to live more vulnerably, it's of course important to know when to seek professional support. If your emotions are preventing you from sleeping, preventing you from working, preventing you, very importantly, from taking care of your care partner, it's certainly time to seek support. And in the 10th chapter of my book, I talk about resources for caregivers. The website Psychology Today is an easy one, a great website to find mental health professionals who take your insurance and work in your neighborhood. I want to go back to this picture for a moment. It popped up on my phone a few months ago, the anniversary of my dad's death, as it does every year. I was thinking about why I took that picture. I didn't take it because I was feeling so sad and isolated and burnt out. I was certainly feeling those things. But I took it because I was feeling something else. I was feeling so proud of myself. So proud that I was able to take care of my dad for 6 years. Proud that I was able to take care of him after my mom, his wife, 22 years younger, died suddenly. Proud that I was able to get him onto Medicaid. Proud that I was able to give him a quality of life for a few more years. And in that moment, I was connecting to what so many of my patients have experienced. And that is the idea that meaning and suffering can coexist. And when I talk about this and write about this, I use this metaphor of the creme brulee, which happens to be my favorite dessert. For those of you who are not creme brulee aficionados, when a creme brulee is done properly, it is crispy on the outside and it's creamy on the inside, and it's cold on the inside and it's hot on the outside. And when you take that first bite, there's so much going on. This is how I think about the emotional experience of caregiving. At any one time, we can feel sadness and fear and disgust and anger and hopelessness and love and strength and growth and pride and connection. The suffering and the meaning can coexist in a creme brulee. And I want to be very clear here that I am not talking about the power of positive thinking. I am not talking about turning lemons to lemonade. That is not who I am as a therapist or a person. But I am saying that in situations in which we suffer, and as family caregivers, there is suffering, that we all have the opportunity, the potential to connect to what's meaningful. And I want to share some typical routes through which we can accomplish this. And the first is through choosing our attitude, choosing how we respond to the limitations with which we are faced. And I will admit my dad was my greatest teacher in attitude. Stuck in the hospital, if he was awake and aware and oriented, he made best use of his hospital bed. We wanted to play that game of chess we always had once a week. And when stuck at home in his hospital bed, when he could not use his legs, he made sure to strengthen his arms. He pushed himself. That was his attitude. Attitude for my dad meant setting a goal. His goal was to walk down the New Jersey boardwalk after being in that coma. And he practiced every day walking in the hallway with our home health aides. And a year later, he was able to walk down that boardwalk on his own. That's attitude. Thinking about how we as caregivers can choose to face our limitations, our losses, our challenges. Second route is to reconnect with your authentic sense of self. Now, so many caregivers say to me, I feel like I've become disconnected from who I am because of caregiving, because I'm no longer able to work full time. I'm no longer able to travel. I'm no longer able to do all the things that I once was able to do. I'm no longer myself. And in response, I'll say, well, is who you are authentically deep down changed? And the answer is usually no. And so I want you all to consider right now your answer to the question, who am I? Who are you deep down authentically? And how can you remain connected to that authentic part of yourself to help carry you through the challenges of caregiving? Again, I'm going to use my dad as an example. Always a musician, stuck in a hospital bed. He still conducted. He still practiced his art. He was never going to stop. And for me, I had a first career as a ballet dancer, and his hospital bed made a great ballet bar. I reconnected during my caregiving years with the authentic dancer inside of me, the part of myself that was grounded and sturdy and joyous. And I'll share too, that part of myself has carried me through grief. 6 months after my dad died, I got on stage wearing his clothing and using his cane and danced on stage. And while I got off stage and cried and cried and cried, it was a creme brulee moment. I felt all the emotions. It was incredibly meaningful. So who we are authentically, it's always there. It's our choice to reconnect with that part of ourselves. And yet, at the same time, every one of us who's a caregiver is going to change and grow. You're meeting Allison 5.0 today. Allison 2.0 took care of her dad years ago. Caregiving has dramatically changed who I am. I'm a much more peaceful and grounded version of myself than the woman who began this journey. All of us learn new things about ourselves. And while I'm sure that most of us, I'm making an assumption, would give caregiving back, we all actually grow in wonderful ways that can serve us as we move forward in our lives, whether or not our caregiving journey ends with the death of our care partner or not. And it can be very meaningful to consider the ways in which you all have also grown. A third route to connecting to meaning is how we all can take responsibility for our lives. We all are given one life as we know it, and it's our responsibility to use our life. And it can be very overwhelming to have that idea in mind when you're a caregiver, when you feel like you're out of control of your life, when your dreams have been deferred or your goals are put on hold, for example. But I want to highlight that taking responsibility means redefining what is self-care. Self-care is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot these days. I dare to say that for me and for many of my patients, I'm guessing for some of you, self-care has to do with energy. It's anything we can do to preserve our energy, because we as family caregivers do not have a limitless supply of energy. So I want you to consider, what does self-care mean to you, and make a commitment to doing it. And that might mean creating boundaries. I had to cut people out of my life. People who didn't support me, who didn't buoy me up. It was courageous to do so, but necessary for my own well-being. Taking responsibility for your life also means asking for help. We as caregivers are usually not very good at asking for help. We're phenomenal at giving help and not as great at asking for it. But asking for help is one of the most important things that you can do, because none of us can do this alone. And I want to encourage you, when you ask for help, whatever that help is, I want you to be as specific as possible. The more specific you can be, the more likely your needs are going to be met. And I want you to lean on others. If offers of help come your way, say yes immediately. If you don't know what you need help with in that moment, just say yes and say, I'll get back to you. For me, I will say there was no way that I could have taken care of my dad without leaning on others, without this team of home health aides we finally put into place. This picture was taken on what would have been my dad's 97th birthday with his home health aides. He died 6 days before. And these aides not only took care of my dad, but their presence allowed me to live some semblance of a normal adult life in my 30s. I could not have done it without them, but it required that I allowed myself to ask for help and to lean on them. And a final route to connecting a meaning is very simple. It's through our five senses, through what we see and touch and taste and smell and hear, through feelings of love, through visions of beauty, through moments of humor. We can feel connected to one another and connected to something even greater than ourselves. Now, I had a very warm and loving relationship with my dad, as I've shared. And so for me, connecting to him through love, through tight handholds, through hugs, this was meaningful. But this route to meaning is available whether or not you have a relationship with your care partner like the one that I had with my dad. If you have a very toxic, unhealthy, even abusive relationship, well, you can still rely on your five senses. When you're stuck in the emergency room and you can't leave, but your care partner maybe is taken somewhere for a test, well, that's a great opportunity to put your earbuds in and get lost in your favorite piece of music. Or step out of the emergency room and feel the sunshine on your skin and reconnect to the part of yourself that enjoys nature. Or go to the cafeteria and sip your favorite tea. And when you do, close your eyes and imagine drinking that tea when you were a child. My point here is that through these very mundane experiences through our five senses, we can have very brief moments that are meaningful and powerful medicine for us. I want to end by saying that many caregivers come to see me in the clinic, because they want to help their care partner experience a bucket list item, reach a certain milestone. And I want to say, I think goals are very important, right? My dad had the goal to walk down the shore, and he did. I think these goals are very, very critical. But I also want to highlight something that has probably become very clear to many of you, and that is, despite all the challenges of caregiving, every day that we are a caregiver provides an opportunity for different types of bucket list moments. And in many ways, caregiving can be our ultimate teacher, because caregiving gives us endless opportunities to practice letting go, to practice saying goodbye. Every time we say goodnight to our care partner, it's an opportunity to practice letting go. Every time we leave the hospital, it's an opportunity to practice letting go. Every time our care partner is taken away for a medical exam is an opportunity to practice letting go. And with that repeated practice, all of us as caregivers develop the capacity to live more mindfully and more fully and more meaningfully. And for that, I remain grateful to caregiving. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm looking forward to having a rich discussion with all of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Applebaum. I want to speak on behalf of everyone. Some folks are messaging me privately to say that they're really enjoying all of these themes you're touching on. I have a few questions in the chat, and I want to encourage folks, if they have additional questions, to put them in the chat, and I will moderate them. So first, a clarification. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk about, I believe, the section of your book of talking about qualifying for Medicaid for long-term care. And some folks are asking for clarification. Their understanding is that, which is true, is that you have to financially qualify for Medicaid. So can you expand a little bit more on that?
Absolutely. So yes, one has to qualify financially to get onto Medicaid. And my dad, like many older adults in this country, fell into a gray zone financially. He made too much. He made too much over the Medicaid limit. I think at the time it was something like $26,000 a year. But he made, in totality, I think he made about $41,000 a year, which was not enough to live on in New York City to pay for his healthcare and everything else. What I learned was that there's the possibility to place funds in excess of that Medicaid limit into what's called a special needs trust. This is a legal way to do it. I had the guidance of a pro bono lawyer who had walked me through this. And once those funds are put into that special needs trust, your care partner can then qualify for Medicaid. And the funds that are in that trust, you then use it like a bank account. And I used it then to pay for supplies, for his home health care, and even to pay his home health aides, the ones that were not paid through Medicaid. And so when the process itself took us it took a little bit over a year, but in part because he was making more than that Medicaid limit. I hope that's helpful. And
Yeah.
I do go through all of that in the book because I will say this was so enormously complicated for me. I will say getting my dad onto Medicaid felt much more difficult than getting my doctorate. And it shouldn't be this hard, which is why I wanted to outline the steps that I took to take away a little bit of the mystery behind the process, but it does take a long time. I also include in the book, I had worked with an organization that's called the New York Legal Assistance Group, NILAG. And in the book, I have a website link that links to similar correlate organizations in every state in the country. And so I really encourage you to look for organizations that can help you with this process. I couldn't have done it alone. None of us should do this alone. Please do ask for help.
Thank you so much. I also want to remind everyone on the link that you should go to someone who is in the state you're joining us from. So we have people today probably from Pennsylvania, Jersey, Delaware, maybe New York too. And some of these things can be state to state. So
Definitely state by state. And I will say New York tends, as I'm understanding it, to have some of the shortest wait times, and our wait time was a year. So I just know that it's a long process.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, any suggestions on how to handle the patient or person's denial, or I'm going to edit this a little and say maybe lack of insight that he or she has the diagnosed problem?
This is so difficult and so common. I want to share with you that a lot of the research that I've done is in working with patients with various brain tumors and their caregivers. And I've done a lot of interviews with individual patient and caregivers and together. And what we find is that overwhelmingly, caregivers have very accurate understanding of illness and prognosis, whereas patients oftentimes really don't want to talk about it, are not ready to talk about it, or are purely in denial. My best piece of advice for you is that you are not responsible for changing your care partner's understanding. That is the responsibility of the healthcare team. And so if you're in this situation, I strongly encourage you to reach out to the physician, the person who's really navigating the care. Perhaps it's a neurologist, it certainly was in our case, and share with them the concern you have about your care partner's understanding. Again, take that responsibility off your shoulders.
Advice, thank you. Okay, this is more of a comment than a question, but I'm curious your thoughts on it. This person says, there wasn't really talk about when you're taking a break from caregiving and you don't feel guilty when you're doing that.
Wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, yeah, I think that's real, right? There was no way that I could have gotten through my journey over a decade and not taken breaks and allowed myself to enjoy. So that's very real. And I'm happy to hear that you're having that experience. What I was getting at with the guilt is that too often I hear the opposite. I'll hear caregivers who finally put into place all of these assurances so that they can take that weekend away, but then they go away for the weekend and they spend that entire weekend feeling guilty that they're away. That's not helpful. I'm thrilled to hear whoever asked that question or made the point that you had those moments. I hope everyone in this Zoom room allows themselves to have a guilt-free time away. That's the goal. The reason I brought up guilt in the way that I did is that guilt is the red flag. Guilt is the red flag that we are neglecting ourselves. That guilt, we learn it and we hear inside that we're letting our care partner down. But the reality is that if we were to do what that guilt tells us to do, we're going to neglect ourselves. So bravo to whoever asked that. And I hope you have many, many more guilt-free moments. Everyone in the room has guilt-free moments of respite. Everyone deserves it.
Amen. Okay, this is an interesting question. Thank you for sharing all that you did. I'm curious about why you sometimes use the term care partner. What do you see as being the difference between care partner and caregiver?
I love this question. Thank you so much. I see no difference whatsoever. So there are two phrases that I use throughout today. I think I use loved one maybe once, but my two that I go with are caregiver and care partner. I like both of these, and I can tell you about why, and the ones I really don't like and I write about. Caregiver I like because we as caregivers, we give of ourselves, right? The energy is coming out of us. Caregiver feels very authentic. And care partner or partner in care, I like in part because it often is a partnership. Now that can change over time, but for many of us, it feels like a partnership. And at least in the beginning of my journey, it certainly did. So I think both of these phrases are accurate and appropriate. I will share with you two that are not, and then one point about the National Alliance for Caregiving. So two that are not. One is the phrase informal caregiver. And I'm going to share that I'm very guilty as charged that in the first 6 years of my career, it's a phrase that I used. And I used it because I saw it in a lot of the scientific literature on dementia caregiving. Cancer caregiving came later, the work that I've been doing. But the dementia caregiving literature was quite robust for a while through the late 90s into the early 2000s. And informal caregiver was used. And I realized a few years ago how incredibly invalidating and inaccurate and disrespectful that word informal is. Because there's nothing informal about any of the work that we do as caregivers. And the other phrase that is not appropriate is the word caretaker, which is something I also hear people saying. Now, caretaker by definition is someone who takes care of property, land, or a funeral home. That is not what we are doing in caring for a person. But also think about that word caretaker. Caretaker insinuates a taking something. And I dare to say all of us in this room know that caregiving is about giving, not taking. So that's also not a great one. What I want to mention about the National Alliance for Caregiving is that we've been having these discussions about what is the right language to use. And one of their goals for the next year and some of the work they're doing is to come to more consensus on the language around caregiving. So I want you all to look out for what they come up with in the next year. I think it's going to be quite interesting.
Great. I actually have a question I'm going to throw in. So many of the caregivers that we work with feel a lack of sort of hope of what the future can look like, that sort of resilience and growth pieces that you were talking about at the end of your talk today. And I'm wondering if you have examples of, maybe former clients you've worked with, or maybe clients you're presently working with, what that kind of post-caregiving growth looks like for them.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking this, because I think that when we are in it, it is so hard to see the possibilities in the future. I have the gift as a psychologist in doing this work clinically, professionally, but I can take the zoom out lens and see the trajectory for people's lives. So some of the things that I've seen happen repeatedly, actually, is that many patients I've worked with have shifted careers as a result of caregiving. There's someone I have in mind who worked in the financial sector and took care of their partner. Their partner died of a brain tumor. But the experience of taking care of their partner and going through all that they had really shifted the prescription in their eyes in terms of what was important in life. And this patient went on to study nursing and is actually in nursing school right now. And so that's an example. I have a handful of caregivers I've worked with who've actually gone through career shifts. That's one way we see it. Another, for example, is I have lost track of caregivers who've told me that they have found their voice as a result of caregiving. That because they've had to speak up with so many healthcare professionals that they once were shy, but now they've become so outspoken that they are able to excel in their career in a new way that they never were able to before. Others for whom the caregiving experience really highlighted the power of relationships. They've really taken time to invest in relationships in a new way. I'll also acknowledge that, yes, our lives get put on hold. Our dreams do get put on hold when we are in the caregiving, experience. I talk about in the book, I spent collectively years of my life stuck in the hospital. Most of my 30s were passing me by. But I nonetheless set goals for myself. This book began by my emailing myself snippets while standing by my dad's bedside. I'm not encouraging you all to write books. That's if you want to, right? There's lots of good things and things about writing books. But I do encourage you to think about what in small ways can you continue or start to put energy towards a dream, a new goal for the future. I think there's many ways that we can all do that. Allison, I don't know if I answered your question. I hope that I did.
Absolutely. That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And there's a comment about what you just said, actually, that says, I agree with you that there is lots of meaning and growth in the experience of caregiving, particularly of someone you really love. Yet, my experience has been that I need to make opportunities for a little distance to make contact with these things. The day-to-day can feel very meaningless and tedious.
I love this. This is so, so spot on. Thank you for whoever said this. Yes. If we're just in the thick of it at all times, it is so difficult to reconnect that meaning. That's why, by the way, those guilt-free time away is so critical, because when you're in that car or train or plane, or you're just down the block and you're not at home with your care partner, you're able to reconnect in your mind and your heart and your soul with the good stuff that's there. I also want to comment because, of course, I had this very incredibly warm relationship with my dad. But I also acknowledge that we can make meaning and purpose despite relationships being difficult or toxic or abusive. I'm thinking of somebody I worked with who her mother was very abusive to her emotionally. And in her early adulthood, after going to therapy, she created a distance from her mom. She took a break from her relationship with her mom. And her mom had reached back out to her at the time her mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. There was no one else to take care of her. And my patient really struggled with whether or not she should even respond. She eventually did. And she looked initially at caregiving as a potential opportunity to repair that relationship. And when that didn't happen, because that was completely unrealistic, as often it is, what she realized is that she would always be able to look back on her life once her mom died without regret, to know that she made a step to take care of her, despite the traumatic past they had had. So we can have very meaningful experiences, even when the person we're taking care of may not have the type of relationship that I've shared that I had with my dad.
It's really powerful. Thank you. I want to ask for kind of a last call for questions, because I've reached the end of the chat. So let's give it maybe a minute, see if folks have any last things. We have just a few minutes left. In the meantime, I'm going to say to Dr. Applebaum, thank you so, so much for coming today. This was really fantastic. I want to remind everyone that a link to her book, which is fabulous, I just finished reading it a few weeks ago, and I highly recommend it, is in the chat. We'll also put it on our website and our Facebook page. And we will also distribute a recording of the talk for anyone signed up today for people who were not able to make it. Okay, now as predicted, all right, we have 5 minutes. We have 2 more questions coming in. Do you have a moment?
I'm here, absolutely,
Great.
please.
All right, great. Okay, so any thoughts on how to ask friends or family for help when they're not stepping forward?
Yes, so key. So the XYZ technique, okay? It's harder to do this without me writing it out. I feel X when you do Y because is Z. It's a powerful communication technique that we can use for any scenario. It makes me feel sad when you don't offer help because I've been doing this alone the entire time. And then ask for help again. Unfortunately, and I'm sure many of you will agree with me, we as family caregivers need to do a hell of a lot of education about what we need and what should be done to all those in our network. Unfortunately, we can't rely on everyone just stepping up. But in the experience of so many of my patients, when they feel like the support is dwindled, right after the initial diagnosis, after a medical crisis is over, things get quiet, but your needs are still very, very real. So I want you to try that XYZ technique. I go into it in the book, but just again, make your needs known. Say why it's important. Say why you need help. And again, none of us can do this on our own. And if no help is forthcoming, patient is hurt, spouse is overworked, ask someone else. Look, the reality is that we only have control over ourselves, right? Unfortunately. So you do your best, you all become expert communicators through caregiving, and you still don't get the answer you want. Don't waste your energy. Pivot, ask someone else, get creative, problem solve.
It's great advice. I also liked your earlier point I think you made about asking for very specific things. So rather than just
More
saying, I need
specific would be the
help.
better. So
Right.
one thing that I did, I kept on my phone a running list, like in a memo a running list of things that I needed, anywhere from I need to order new diapers for my father to getting food to like there was a leak in the sink. I need to repair the sink to, all the mundane things that pile up and get so overwhelming when you're really dealing with the thick of caregiving. And so whenever anyone would say, can I help you? I would say, yes, actually, I have a list of things. And the more specific you can be, it's just easier when I offer help to people, if they say yes, and I'll say, well, what can I do? And they're like, I don't know. Well, that doesn't help me. But if you tell me I need food for the next 3 days, easy, I can do that. So I want you all to be really, really specific. Challenge yourselves for that. And by the way, when you ask for help, I'm sure the things on your list have everything to do with your care partner, but also put some stuff on there for you. What do you need?
Nice. All right, a lot of positive reinforcement. Thank you for supporting me as I make this journey of caregiving yet again. Best presentation I've heard in a long time, current and so relevant. Thank you for this. So lots of thanks extended to you, and I'll second that as well. It looks like we're just coming up on 2 p.m., so I think we're going to wrap up. But again, I'm being redundant. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Don't be strangers. You can find me on all the links that I sent, and Allison can share those around as well. So
Absolutely.
take good care and best wishes for all of your caregiving journeys.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.